how to start this introduction. My name's Anwar Majid. I've known Greg for a long time. And I want to be able to show you the first time I met him. What, were you young? So was I. That's the first time I met Greg. I was in Arizona in the early to mid-90s, and I was very impressed by his scholarship, his research, and the book he had published then, we had Look to the Mountain, an ecology of indigenous education, and it was just an incredible encounter. And years later, my family and I went to visit him in the reservation of Santa Clara, New Mexico. And one of my children, get to take a photograph with a woman who was his son's, at that time she was his son's girlfriend. And apparently he moved, anyway. But she was a model for the Native American Sacagawea, who was the model for the $1 coin, if you remember that, a Native American woman. So we had that picture. It was an incredible set of circumstances that got us together. And now, since then, I hadn't seen him till now. But did you recognize me? Yeah. Okay. Okay, well. No, but we've changed. We've changed. It's a great honor to have him here. I gave him license to say anything he wants, because he has a different set of presentations ranging from hardcore science, the kind of thing I don't understand, to something a little bit more humanistic and philosophical, which I can grasp. So we leave it up to him to decide how to present today. But basically, it's to give us a sense of the Native American view of knowledge, science, and education. I mean, his biography is extremely long. His accomplishments are even longer. But he has, he has lectured at colleges and universities in the United States, Canada, Mexico, New Zealand, Italy, Japan, Russia, Taiwan. He was in Taiwan this past December. Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, England. Bolivia, by the way, he told me about a lot of those coins, these $1 coins that had the picture of Sacagawea. Apparently now they're very hard to find items. So maybe I should take a trip to Bolivia to see if I can find some, because they were really very good to have. He worked at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico for 21 years. While at the Institute, he served as Dean of the Center for Research and Cultural Exchange, Chair of Native American Studies, and Professor of Ethnoscience. He organized and directed the first and second annual National Native American Very Special Arts Festival held in respectively Santa Fe, New Mexico in '91 and Albuquerque in '92. In '95, he was offered a position in American Indian education at the University of New Mexico College of Education. He is currently the Director of Native American Studies and a professor in the Division of Language Literacy and Sociocultural Studies in the College of Education at the University of New Mexico. He has received several fellowships and academic distinctions, including the American Indian Graduate Fellowship from the U.S. DOE Office of Indian Education, the Darcy McNichol Fellowship in American Indian History from the Newberry Library, Chicago, the first Catherine Lehman Fellowship in American Indian Art and Education from the School of American Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico, etc. He's a practicing ceramic, pastel, and metal artist. He's extensively involved with art and its application to education. He's also a scholar of herbalism and holistic health. In this capacity, he has researched Native American, Chinese, and Ayurvedic healing philosophies and the cultural perspectives of health and wholeness. He also designs culturally responsive curricula geared to the special needs and learning styles of Native American students. This curricula are based upon Native American understanding of the nature, or quote, nature of nature, and utilizes this foundation to develop an understanding of the science and artistic thought process as expressed in indigenous perspectives of the natural world. Dr. Cajete has authored 7 books: Look to the Mountain, An Ecology of Indigenous Education, which I just showed you, Ignite the Sparkle, an Indigenous Science Education Curriculum Model, Spirit of the Game, Indigenous Wellsprings, People's Ecology, Explorations in Sustainable Living, and Native Science, Natural Laws of Interdependence. Critical Neurophilosophy, and Indigenous Wisdom, which will be was published in 2010, Indigenous Community Teachings of the Seventh Fire, published in 2015. Dr. Cajete also has chapters in 25 other books, along with numerous articles and over 275 national and international presentations. So I think it goes without saying that we're in the presence of an incredibly accomplished scholar, teacher, and educator. So help me welcome Greg Cajete to the podium.
When they read my bio, I always wonder, who in the world is that guy? Sengi Thamo, as we say, or Sengi Hung, as we say in my language, Tewa. My name is Greg Cajete. I'm from Santa Clara Pueblo, and we're one of 6 Tewa-speaking pueblos north of Santa Fe. And I guess our most famous historical story is that we were the instigators of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, which drove the Spanish back to Mexico and won the freedom of the Pueblo nations there, so that we were able to retain our land base in ways that other tribes, unfortunately, in the United States were not. So I come to you really as a Pueblo scholar, and it really is a pleasure to be in Maine. This is really the first time I've given a talk in Maine, and I have been to Biddeford, but not necessarily, or passing through Portland, so I haven't stayed in Portland. It's a very beautiful city, lots to offer. Anwar and I had tea earlier before the presentation, and we were talking about what I should present, and again, I have many kinds of presentations that I could give. I was not able to find in my massive presentations the one I had intended to give. So what you see on the board is what I will give in terms of the thoughts and perspectives on Native science. I noticed that some of you do have copies of Native Science, which this presentation will be about. Native Science is probably the most known of my books. I do have 2 other books that are coming out actually at the end of March. These are edited books of my students' work. 2 volumes, Sacred Journeys and the Native Mind Rising. Both are going to be published by a Canadian publisher, and promise to be actually a really powerful book in terms of the work of my many students, along some of the lines that you'll hear in this presentation. So I'll get right at it. An ecological philosophy of Native science, living the earth, facing the sun, and seeking the light. This presentation really is provocative, and it's designed to be that way, in the sense that one of the kinds of things that has been happening in Indigenous country has been the rise of the Indigenous mind in the context of scholarship, in terms of economics, and also in terms of governance, a number of different kinds of areas. Native Indigenous peoples have been active not only in the United States and Canada, but throughout North America, Mexico, Central and South America, throughout the Indigenous world. There are about 600 million Indigenous peoples. And as it turns out, being Indigenous peoples, because of our connection to the land, because of our unique philosophies of culture and tradition that are largely ecological, we tend to be at the forefront of a lot of the issues that deal with environmental degradation and also that deal with human rights. So throughout the world, you find Indigenous people really at the forefront of some of the most consequential issues of the time, particularly as it relates to environmental crisis that we face, global climate change. So I've been a scholar of native science really since I'm trained as a biologist. That was my first as a field biologist. And so I took on teaching as a way to sort of spread the word and to really begin to explore the question, what is indigenous science? What is the basis of that? What are our traditions of native science, and how can I bring that forward into the light, as I say in this title? So this title really evokes a thought and a perspective that I think is essential in this time and place that we find ourselves as people really in the precipice of some very, very challenging times because of climate change. I say as an educator that quintessentially there are three essential fundamental issues that we face today. The first one is how are we going to develop a better relationship to the earth? The second one, how are we going to develop a better relationship to each other? And the third one is how are we going to develop a better relationship to that entity that guides it all? That entity which is called God sometimes, and many other kinds of ways and names of different cultures and traditions. But is that unique, innate quality that we have within each of us called spirituality. And so those are the three quintessential issues that we face today. And it's about relationship. Indigenous worldviews are relational in nature. They are, by their nature, ecological because they grew from different people's relationship to places on the earth. And it's indigenous peoples that continue to practice these ways of knowing, these ways of understanding, these ways of connection. Albeit in many cases, some of this has been traumatically interrupted by colonization. In other places where colonization was not apparent, indigenous peoples have been trying to hold on to the last vestiges of these connections, these understandings. Hence, always indigenous people being at the forefront of a lot of environmental justice issues. This slide, through the native eye, being an artist, I like to start with evoking that deeper sense of connection and understanding, and art really does the job, when it comes to this kind of connection and displaying it and representing it. So this piece is called In the Native Eye. And you can see the native eye in the lower right-hand corner. As that native eye peers out into the environment, what the native eye sees is a tapestry of interrelationship, interdependence. Relationship with corn in my area, the Southwest, eagle, bear, hummingbird, antelope, the forces of nature, the sun, the moon. This idea is a tapestry of interrelationship, ecological relationship that permeates all of the thinking of indigenous people, wherever you find them, actually. So as indigenous people, while we're very diverse in terms of languages, in terms of places in which we live, what we have in common is this understanding of connection, of relationship to the places in which we live. So that evokes these thoughts, these perspectives. For quite some time, indigenous thought has been sort of placed in this anthropological, archaeological sphere, as if it was interesting to study, but really was not of consequence to a modern life, contemporary living. And what's happening with the rise of indigenous scholarship, with the rise of many of the issues that are being faced today worldwide, is that kind of thinking, that indigenous thinking, that way of knowing and understanding relationship is rising as well and becoming much more active. So indigenous thought, for indigenous thought, indigenous worldview, axiology, which means what do your values revolve around, lies in the balance of relations. The epistemology, which is how you come to know what you know, is based on observing, doing, making, symbolizing, rhythm, ritual, and ceremony. The logic is all elements and beings of the multiverse, not a universe, a multiverse, are linked together. And the process is working within the understanding that all things are dependently interrelated in the harmony and balance of this multiverse. So this is a worldview. This is the indigenous worldview that is held in common. And this is why I can say, and why you can actually use the term indigenous in the sense of the context of talking about cultures and traditions that have maintained this worldview into modern times. The bottom slide represents the medicine wheels in Wyoming. And 8 to 10,000 years ago, as Paleo-Indians began to explore the universe in a variety of different kinds of ways through their forms of native science. So native science is a product of a different creative journey than Western science. It's not better than Western science, but it's the result of a different kind of journey. There has been the tendency, even within the context of Western science, to sort of negate that there has ever been anything other than Western science. And of course, we know that's not true. Every culture has its science. Every culture has a deepened understanding of the places and has contributed to man's knowledge, of the nature of things and the nature of nature. So native science is a metaphor for native knowledge. It is the stories of the world that include these creative ways for living and participating in relationship with the world through the processes for seeking life and relationship and meaning. Among my people, we have a lot of different ways, that we describe and what I call we remember to remember these understandings, these perspectives. And one of them is we use the term woatsegi, for life's sake we do this. And as I studied over the years, indigenous traditions, particularly indigenous languages, I often also find terms that are used in other indigenous languages, not just Native American, but other languages around the world, which mean exactly the same thing, which are evoked in times to help people to remember why they're doing something, why something is important, and also permeates and comes from and rises from this way of understanding our relationship to each other and also to the world around us. That slide is one of the mound builder sun priests greeting the sun during summer solstice. So sense, perception, and creative participation really has been the hallmark of native science. So that an indigenous physicist not only observes the world, but participates in it with all his or her essential being. Everything in nature is alive and with energy. So this is a precept of native science that has become more and more integrated also into Western science, particularly in the realm of quantum physics. So therefore, becoming open to the natural world with all of one's senses, body, mind, and spirit, is the goal of native science. That slide is from Fajada Butte, atop which lie the Sun Dagger, very famous in the world for being the only site that measures the moon and the sun during the moon and sun's journey, the equinoxes, and also the 18.5-year cycle of the moon. So again, either of the slides represent these understandings that have been, in a sense, incorporated into the expression of native science. Albeit, to the chagrin, I guess, of some, native science is as elaborate, if not even more elaborate than Western science. And in the time and in those cultures and those traditions, led the people in terms of these understandings and perspectives of their relationship to the earth, and particularly have become now, the focus of anthropology, the focus of archaeology. But in their time, they were, in a sense, the essence of life of the people. And the wisdom and the grounding that these sciences have are just now being rediscovered, in Western science. So the creative context of seeking life, what is this process that I'm talking about that was the foundation of native science? Well, it was a kind of dynamic creativity that both was an ordering principle and also keyed in on the process that the peoples themselves perceived in the universe. The natural creativity includes things like what David Bohm talked about, Western quantum physicist, the implicate and explicate order, the understanding that everything that happened, in our world also was represented in a much larger universe, and that all of this is connected in this large web of being. And so these ideas that have been now just coming into their own within Western science have certainly been a part of the thinking and the understanding of other cultures during time. And so we're just beginning to really realize that depth of history, that richness of history in terms of human sciences. I would call them human sciences. So chaos in order, order in chaos, complex adaptive systems, fractal processes are expressions of these dynamic principles and actually were understood by many, many forms of native science. As the sun is going across that Fajada Butte at noontime, a dagger of light cuts behind those three stones that I just showed you. These are the three stones here. Right behind them is a carved spiral. So as the sun is moving across the horizon at noontime on summer solstice, there's a dagger of light that is formed behind those three stones that marks within actually about 3 to 4 minutes the exact time of summer solstice. There are no moving parts, absolutely no modern multi-billion-dollar technological contraptions, just three stones, a spiral, and an understanding of movement, a perception of movement. So this idea of an indigenous physicist is part of this context and this perspective. An indigenous physicist observes not only the world, but participates in it. That's also a key understanding, that perspective. So as we begin to look at this understanding a little bit further, what is the native mind? So I used the term earlier, one of the titles of the book that's just coming out is called Native Minds Rising. Well, the native mind reveals itself through abstract symbols, artistic, visual spatial reasoning, through sound, through kinesthetics, through expression and various forms of creative, ecological, integrative, and spiritual thinking. So when you look at an indigenous society like my own, we're just coming off our animal dances, our deer dances, deer and buffalo dances, in which we honor, our relationship to those animals and to their life. And it includes song, it includes dance, it includes music, it includes prayer, it includes visual symbols and representation of visual symbols in a variety of ways. Our traditional art forms, represent those same symbols. This is true of every indigenous culture in terms of how they represent their knowledge, their understanding, and their connections to these understandings, these deep understandings. So this is why Native science is expressed through story, through art, through song, through dance, through ritual, through music, through community, through hunting, through fishing, through farming, through healing, through architecture, and through astronomies. So as you study any indigenous culture, you'll find the Native science that is a part of that culture embedded into any and all of these representations. The bottom slide is Casa Rinconada, which is also in Chaco Canyon, which is as close to a perfect circle as is possible using human measurement, and measurement from the tip of your index finger to the beginning of your wrist, from the beginning of your wrist to your elbow all the way to your shoulder blade. And that's the basic human measurement. And the 5 fingers, and or the 10 fingers and the 10 toes, depending on how you're doing that. So we're looking at, our histories. So one of the endeavors of indigenous scholarship is to look at our histories and reclaim that history and bring it forward, bring the principles and the ideas forward into a contemporary expression. And that essentially is what Native Studies programs, the Native Study program that I direct or have directed, and other Native Studies programs, and the scholarship that our students are doing at this time, is to bring forward those understandings, those perspectives, and give it a contemporary expression. So there is a process to Native science, and it includes very similar, very parallel to the Western creative process, but has some extras, some other things incorporated into it as well. There's a period of preparation. There's adherence to natural patterns. So there's theory behind it. There's polychromatic time. That means things happen in different ways at different times. Everyone has a responsibility for some aspect of that knowledge. That knowledge is presented at the right place at the right place with right intent. In other words, there has to be a purpose for the knowledge to be gained and to be applied. There's an intrinsic, a well-practiced belief behind that knowledge. There's what we call a packing of a symbol. So I know that a lot of people collect Native art, but particularly traditionally Native art is what we call a packed symbol. There is meaning and deep philosophical understanding that goes into those symbols, and those understandings and perspectives represent the way the people have expressed their connection to the places, to the plants, to the animals that they live in, to the place that they live in. So there's a vigil, a completion, a giveaway, and an appreciation of intrinsic meaning. So many Native traditions and many Native peoples have celebrations. And these celebrations are times when the community comes together to celebrate their life as a community, their life in relationship, but also to celebrate the life of the plants, the animals, and the place itself. So these celebrations involve giveaway, involve feasting. There's not a single tribe that doesn't have some celebration where feasting and this kind of remembering to remember is not a part of this process. So this is Native science too. So what is, and this is kind of long, but I'll try to read through it. So what are the tenets of Native philosophy that stems from this worldview? First of all, spiritual agency. Everything comes back and starts with and ends up and comes back in a circular form to that spiritual instinct that each human being has. It's perpetual, multi-dimensional harmony. All knowledge is related to the creation and perpetuation of the natural world. Everything has spirit. All is related. Everything and every place has a role. Mutual reciprocity. Everything has a history. Everything is expressed from listening, dialogue, appropriate technology, context, dreams, patterns, cycles, elders, ritual, knowledge initiation, story, observation, and renewal of life. So if you were to sort of package, what is indigenous philosophy and how it was expressed, of course, by every tribe was very unique to that tribe, this would be the package. And I'm going to interject kind of my byline at this point. Why is indigenous knowledge important to study? Why is indigenous knowledge important during this time in human development? Because this is precisely the philosophy that we have to begin to get back to. And I have to say that many ecological philosophers, Western ecological philosophers, are moving and saying exactly the same thing. We have to get back to this deeper understanding of our relationship to each other, our relationship to the land and the places that give us life. And so that's why, and that's really the place of native science and native philosophy and the study of native science and native philosophy. So, what is indigenous science? It's a multi-contextual system of thought, action, and orientation applied by indigenous people through which they interpret how nature works in their place. So native science is a place-based science, okay? The technologies, the skills, the understandings, the insights are based on places. And so as you begin to destroy those places, as those places are no longer habitable, as those places that no longer exist, as species and plants and animals begin to be degraded or disappear, these connections also disappear. So this is why indigenous people fight so diligently for places in which they live, for their ancestral homes, is because they're tied to it in this very deep and intimate way. And so you find, if you look at what's going on in terms of indigenous people around the world, you'll find that they're all fighting for their places and their spaces and exactly these connections. So what is indigenous knowledge? Well, it's a high context body of knowledge built over many, many generations by a culturally distinct people living in close contact with a place, its plants, its animals, its waters, its mountains, its deserts, etc. And of course, we have many stories, and this is the journey of two warriors to the world of the sun. We have many stories that sort of evoke these understandings and these perspectives in a way that, in a sense, they're educational. They deliver these messages to the people consistently over time and over generations. So the philosophical base of native science, development of knowledge through indigenous science is guided by spirituality, as I said, ethical relationship, mutualism, reciprocity, respect, restraint, a focus on harmony, and an acknowledgement of interdependence. I have to say, also I'm a Western-trained scientist as well, and I do read extensively. I am co-editor of Ecopsychology, and that's the indigenous issue is coming out in June, where, along with other native as well as non-native writers, we're basically saying the same thing that I've just stated. We have to begin to move in the direction of this kind of relationship, this kind of philosophy, this kind of grounding, if you will, in terms of our relationship to the world. So this knowledge is integrated with regard to a particular place toward the goal of long-term sustainability. So indigenous science is by its nature a sustainability science. It is the most ancient sustainability science because when you study indigenous sciences, you find that their intent was always to to maintain, sustain a people in a time, in a place, and through generations. And so inherently, they are all sustainable knowledge systems. So this knowledge is integrated with regard to the particular place. In many levels, it mirrors aspects of Western environmental ethics and practices. But I have to say, Western environmental practices are just beginning to get at the core of this. In other words, very young in terms of the exploration of these deeper levels of relationship that indigenous peoples have continued to practice, when they've been able to do that. So oral transmission, some of the ways in which native science is transmitted is through oral transmission, observation over generations, cyclic time orientation. Quantification is at the macro level, big pictures, not little reduction, measurements, but big picture scenarios. Specific literary styles and symbolism, each tribe had a way to represent these ideas. Knowledge is contextualized to a specific tribe and place. And conservation of knowledge through time and through generations. So when you study indigenous sciences, you're actually studying really human evolution of knowledge systems. And places like Teotihuacan in Mexico, if you've ever visited that place, which is essentially a mountain that is dedicated to the observation of the sun, is an amazing feat. But it was based on these ideas of creating relationship and resonance with this higher order. So I'm going to finish finally with some of this. The protocols of native science include that it integrates a spiritual and ethical orientation. It's dynamic and multidimensional. And its harmony is a perpetual state of the universe. So in other words, let me talk a little bit about this notion of resonance. A lot of people misunderstand why Native people would go to the extent of building these magnificent and amazing structures in Mexico or in the mound builders or, in terms of my area in Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, those places. But part of it is really understanding this notion of trying to create a resonance, and it has to do with the relationality, a resonance to how the world, how the universe works, how the multiverse works. And that was really the intent. That was what, just like Western physics is reaching for the theory of everything. The theory of everything is the big reach, I guess you might say, for quantum physics. For Native people, it was resonance with the everything. It was resonance. Resonance means simply a deep, resounding connection to that thing that gives life to everything. And so traditional knowledge is related to these guiding stories of emergence of humans into the world. So as you study indigenous cultures and traditions, you'll always find that every indigenous culture has an emergence story, a story of origin, a creation story. That is kind of the guiding story. If you really actually look at the guiding stories, the emergent stories, they're amazingly profound and very deeply, they're deep. They have a deep philosophy to them that connects directly to what I'm telling you about in terms of indigenous science. So humanity has an important role in perpetuation and sustainability of the processes in the world. We're now moving into the period of Anthropocene, where humans really actually have inordinate influence on the natural systems of the world. But truthfully, we have, as in terms of indigenous people, we've had guidance. But Western peoples, and particularly modern peoples, which includes all of us all over the globe, modern peoples, have not had the wisdom or have not paid attention to the wisdom that we need to guide us as the purveyors of Anthropocene. And that's what we're searching for. That's what we're beginning to strive to find. What is our role as human beings in a sense, preserving this relationship that gives us all life? So that slide is a representation of the October 1992 National Geographic cover, and it's entitled 1491, or 1490, yeah, it's 14, it's 1491 in terms of just before Columbus. I'm not sure if I got the date right, but I think that really tells, because that's that the artist here is an Iroquois artist, and he's trying to represent a consciousness. Okay, that little shiny thing on top of his head is a kind of a consciousness that he's trying to evoke. He's trying to represent, and it's a consciousness of connection. Okay, to the plants and to the animals, and above him you see a depiction, a symbolized form of Turtle Island, which is Native America, and that idea of connection and consciousness is what he's looking at. Finally, all things of the world are animate and have spirit. There's a significance to each place because each place reflects the whole order of nature. The history of a place must be respected with regard to places, animals, plants, natural phenomena. Each place has a spirit and a story which must be considered and respected. Technology used should be appropriate and reflect balanced relationship with the natural world. So this is what indigenous peoples, as they applied their technologies, were guided by. Sometimes successful, sometimes not successful. But nonetheless, that there was a guiding ethos, there was a guiding philosophy behind the creation of their forms of technology. That slide is a 1,000-year-old membranous pot. It's a sandhill crane and a human effigy figure, and their characteristic is that they're not two designs, they're just one design. It's a positive, negative image, which is a profound statement. You can't pull the sandhill crane apart from the human and the human apart from the sandhill crane. They are one and the same. And that idea is an idea that is repeated more and more often, and has been repeated often by indigenous artists. So application. In terms of policy, policy evolves from the need to sustain the well-being of both human and natural communities through time. Application reflects the worldview of a people. Application sustains the life of a natural place. Policy is based on participatory, community-based research. Science, technology, or research is applied with minimal impact on a human and natural community. So if you were to turn this epistemology, this way of viewing the world, this idea of indigenous science, and turn it into policy, this is what it would look like. And it's not that we haven't had experience, with this. This is a slide of Mesa Verde, some of my ancestral people, the Anasazi, as they created those kinds of places with those kinds of rules of policy. So striving from an ecological philosophy of life, and I'll finish with this, an eco-philosophy that includes life orientation in contrast to language orientation. A commitment to nature and values as opposed to detachment and objectivity. Focus on spiritual vitality in contrast to academic spiritualism. An attempt to gain comprehensive understanding rather than piecemeal analysis. A pursuit of wisdom rather than the accumulation of data. a reorientation of economics towards a holistic quality of life rather than an increase in the GNP, a political orientation that truly focuses upon the greater good rather than financially endowed special interests, cultivation of a social and individual responsibility rather than individualistic autonomy. Such an eco-philosophy honors cultural cosmologies as well as developing a deeper inner consciousness of health as the foundation for the outer transformation of self, community, and society. And that's essentially the goal. Why would you study indigenous sciences? The indigenous sciences gives you, not only are exemplifications of human cultures before ours trying to strive for this kind of resonance and this understanding, but actually how does it apply to us today? It gives us an alternative, a way of looking at our current philosophy, our current situations, economically, socially, and also environmentally, and offers us a kind of viewpoint and understanding from which we can begin to explore some new and possibly more life-sustaining ways of living. And so just as we are going to have to find ways to address the challenges of climate change that are right before us, concomitant to that, and actually even before that, there has to be a transformation of consciousness along with a philosophy that goes with that. And so indigenous peoples, you know, have been trying to, in a sense, not only preserve themselves, but also tell this story. And for me, that's the value. Of course, intrinsically, the indigenous story has a value for myself because I am indigenous. But the value for others that are not indigenous is really in the philosophy and in really a demonstration of a different way of thinking about your relationship to the world, your relationship to each other, and your relationship to this instinct, I guess you would say, or this foundational humanness that we would call spirituality. So I think I'm going to end with that. It's a longer, actually, presentation because, well, I'll go one more. Okay, so as an educator, okay, so how does that translate from philosophy into education? It seeks to reintegrate values within a worldview, just as I've said, in a direct and ecological informed way that mirrors the level of integration once achieved by indigenous peoples. Just as new forms of life are evolutionary, created out of older forms, so new forms of knowledge and systems of learning must be created out of the most promising spiritual and cultural heritages of the past. Much of our collective heritage is worth saving. There's much that is superior, creative, wise, and already ecologically sophisticated. And eco-education would draw from the knowledge, understanding, and creative thinking of past, present, in order to prepare for a sustainable future. So, you know, I end my formal teaching career at the University of New Mexico at the end of the semester. After 46 years as a frontline teacher. But all teachers never die. They just go on to the next curriculum. So my next curriculum is actually this, working with many of my former students, many new students, beginning to really focus on what I call adaptive sustainability education, which really is going to focus on what we need to begin to educate for, the skills, the kinds of understandings and the perspectives that we need to create a knowledge base for, or recreate a knowledge base for, drawing from indigenous sources, drawing from Western sources, drawing from ecological knowledge that we already have, to create a new kind of education that we desperately need right now, and is already in some form, in bits and pieces in different places in the world. But the idea now is to bring it together in a way that it allows it to take the place of our current systems of education, which are failing and are not up to the task and the challenges that are before us in terms of the kinds of knowledge base we have to begin to have in the face of climate change and into the future. So with that, I ask you to collectively be with life and to do the work that you need to do, along these lines. This is the cutting edge. This is the generation that can make a difference, for a better future if we but take that initiative. And I hope that we all do. So with that, Wikunda, thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you so much. If you have any questions, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone before you ask.
And this one last slide is what we just got through doing in my pueblo. We were dancing the buffalo deer dance, so this is a representation of the kinds of dances we do. We still attempt to practice that philosophy and that ceremonial cycle of remembering to remember not only who we are and our relationship, but to maintain that understanding of the cycle of life itself. So I'm ready for questions. Anyone have some questions? Yes?
Hi, thank you for that talk. Recently, I attended a talk at USM. Passamaquoddy language masters were presenting. And in Maine, the public schools need to expose students to the Wabanaki culture. And
Yeah.
they were talking mainly about that. And one of the speakers said that I'm Indian, and I call myself Indian. And I noticed throughout you said indigenous people.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if you've heard that a lot. I didn't get a chance to talk to him afterwards. So just wondering your opinion on that.
Well, there are various terms that Native people use for themselves. The term Indian is one of them. Okay, it's kind of been the vernacular, the historical vernacular, I guess you might say, of the United States. But most Native people would basically call themselves by their traditional native name. Even the term, some of the terms that are used, for tribes are terms that actually come from anthropology or archaeology, and are English, and not necessarily the names of the peoples themselves. So Indian is a historical name. It is related to indigenous, but the term indigenous is now being used. But even that has been questioned, by indigenous peoples themselves, saying no, we're called this, and it's their own traditional name for themselves, which usually is, when translated into English, means the people. The people. So we call the people Toa, which means the people. So you're going to find that kind of discussion among indigenous people. You have to remember that indigenous peoples are coming from hundreds of years of colonization, and are restoring language, restoring traditions, remembering history, looking into their own past, redefining their identities. Now, these, of course, are all things we teach in Native Studies courses, and any school that has Native Studies courses will explore these kinds of how should I say, topics, including the term Indian, but other terms as well. In Canada, they went from First Nations, they went from Indian to First Nations to Aboriginal. So now the correct term is Aboriginal in Canada. So again, what's in a name? In a name is lots of politics, policy, identity, or identity reformation. I mean, there's a lot in a name. So for him, that was the name he preferred. and it's the older name.
We have a question here in the back of the room from one of our UNE students.
Yes.
Hey, do you believe that like the westernized like societal view of like wealth, like having a lot of like money, possessions is like corrupted our view of like the natural world?
In a word, it's come from a worldview that values materiality in a way that spawned capitalism, and I think we have to find our way out of that morass now. I think that capitalism is one of the kinds of notions about relationship that we really have to re-explore. Capitalism really means at its very essence, that you quote unquote, you capitalize on a situation. But I think what has evolved, around capitalism, and particularly its focus on the bottom line and material well-being in exclusion of other forms of well-being, becomes a real issue. And so that it really is something that is being questioned, I think, more so by your generation than ever before. And I think that it's important. In order to, how should I say, to transform a paradigm, there are a lot of challenges, and there's a lot of angst, and there's a lot of stress, and there's a lot of conflict. And that's what we're in right now. We're going through a paradigmatic shift. We're beginning to see and think about what we've done in the past, collectively, globally, and we're rethinking, not only the wisdom of that path, but also its dangers. And I think it's going to be your generation that will, make the move into one direction or another, in terms of this paradigm shift.
We've got a question over here to your right, Professor Kehete.
Yes.
Dr. Kehete, I have two questions, and I think they're really different, but maybe they're kind of similar too. I'm sitting here as I think about my own self as an academic, struggling in the depths of epistemicide, and to hear you talk about Indigenous mind rising feels inspiring. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Where is that Indigenous mind rising from, and where is it going? And then my other question is, particularly in the state of Maine, we're in the whitest state in the nation, and there's a real issue. Well, it's not just the whitest state in the nation. We're also, we've survived some of the most heavily, densely populated genocide in Indigenous North America. But because of that, we're so invisible here in a state. So the depths of epistemicide, are very real. And I think that amongst other Indigenous scholars and Indigenous communities, we struggle with also how do we protect our Indigenous knowledge, so that, what have been your experiences around protection of Indigenous knowledge in light of so much co-optation of the spirituality and knowledge? That seems to be one of those really big tensions. So, two questions. Thank you very much.
That's like 5 questions. Well, I think what we're rising from is that period of, and in circles it's called decolonization. We're rising from our situation of having been colonized and having been decimated in many different kinds of ways, and we're rising, through our own scholarship and also through our own research. Rising, first of all, understanding what happened to us, and then now rising above it to say what is the future for us. What do we need to do to maintain not only ourselves as Indigenous people, but to extend ourselves into the future, which is the quintessential question. So I think a lot of the work that we as Indigenous scholars are doing is the restorative work, restoring identities lost, learning or relearning our history, I should say, and then looking to the future in terms of where do we go from here. And I think all of those areas are areas that current Indigenous scholars are researching or involved with, in some way, either through the work they're doing in their communities or the work of professions that they are going into. So I think that we're in that kind of that process of pulling up again, you know, and moving to a new stage, a new level of our being. Realizing now that we have a lot to offer, even though we've been told that we're margins, we're in the margins. The Native population in the United States is, I think it's about 2% or maybe even less than 2% of the national population. So the highest concentrations are in the Southwest, where I'm from, and also in California. But in spite of that small, because of our heritage, because of our histories, we actually have a much greater impact than just the numbers that we actually represent, you know, in the population. I think in Canada it's rising to 20%, so Indigenous people have a much more visible and much more extensive, because they're a larger part of their population. In Bolivia, 79% of the population is Indigenous, but now has gone through a coup and is fighting back again into similar modes of reclaiming, you know, their rightful place in the country and politics. So that's part of it. You know, we're still in that process of recovery. I guess you would call it recovery from trauma, recovery from recovering. But we also have, as our traditions have told us, we have a commitment and a responsibility to the future. First, beginning with the future of our own communities, but also really the future of our world. You know, when Native people have ceremonies, wherever you find them, and including our own, what I just came from, finished on Sunday, we pray for the whole world. We don't just pray for ourselves. And that is becoming more and more difficult because so many things are happening, you know, and so many things to keep track of. So it's always, for Indigenous people, it's always been about what legacy are we going to leave for our future generations. And so we have, among the Iroquois, they have the 7th generation philosophy. I use the term, and there is a book coming out with this title, and it's a question. What kind of ancestor do you want to be? What kind of ancestor do you want to be? And that's a responsibility. That's a question that stems from this Indigenous thought, this perspective, but it's also a question for everyone. What kind of ancestor do you want to be? And so for us, you know, our elders are important because they represent role models as much as they're able to, you know, and through all the trials and tribulations and trauma that they've been through, they try to represent the best and extend the best into the future, you know, in terms of their wisdom and their tradition. And so we're trying to follow those kinds of precepts. And I think the same is true with, you know, the rise of Indigenous people in scholarship, in academia, the trials and tribulations that we go through in every university, because we're coming from a completely different worldview, a worldview that's relational, and we're in the face of a material worldview that is focused on objectivity and materialism. So we're dealing with both the conflict of worldviews, you know, in the context of academia, but also we're also dealing with issues of identity, issues of history, issues of rights. So that's kind of where we're at, you know, and as the Hawaiians say, it is what it is, you know. And so you deal with the present moment, but you understand that there's this responsibility to the future. So that's the reason for me writing or doing an edited version, two volumes of my students' work. You know, because it's now their turn to move into this very challenging future. And none of them have had the opportunity to write in Western journals, so I provided them an opportunity to create a scaffolding into the world of academe, through the articles and chapters that they've written. So we're all in the same place. What we do now is going to immediately affect, of course, the future that we have before us, the students that we're teaching, but inculating in them this sense of what kind of ancestor do they want to be? I mean, it's a serious question. It's a question of legacy. It's a question of future. It's even a question of future. And so that idea, I think, is a very important idea to begin to explore. But I understand where you're coming from, in terms of the kinds of issues that we face today as Indigenous people in academe. I could stay much longer at the university, but I don't want to. I feel I've done as much as I can for a very ailing institution, and that I only have a certain amount of time, and I have to move on and do other things. But I think it's important. These are important questions of this time. What kind of ancestor do you want to be? And you can only answer that personally in your own space, whatever that space is, whether it's in the university or in a community or in a family. That's the space where you make that change and you make that leap of consciousness.
We have another question here on your left.
Yeah.
As you probably know, last year the New York Times published the 1619 Project.
Yeah.
And for me, it was an amazing eye-opener regarding American history
Yeah.
and racism. Has anyone done a similar project or a writing of history of Indigenous people that tells it like it is versus the American textbook, the history of, you go into any classroom and there's so much distortion and deletion and generalization in those textbooks.
I have to say, yes, I agree that in a lot of classrooms that's the case, but the truth is that there's a tremendous amount of material out there. There have been multiple films that have been created that tell the Indigenous story. It's just that they don't get into mainstream media. They don't get into mainstream publication. My reason for doing the 2 volumes that I've just mentioned, Native Minds Rising and Sacred Journeys, is because my students can't get into Western journals. They're rejected because of their orientation, because of what they're saying is not within the paradigm. So there's such a thing, and there continues to be academic structural racism in terms of the way in which information gets into the system and gets into the classroom. So Native studies programs, or any studies programs, whether it's Africana studies or Chicana studies or Indigenous studies or women's studies, if they are called studies because they don't necessarily match up with the central mainstream Western paradigm. And so hence they're given studies status, but rarely are given department status. And that tells it all, and what happens in that context also happens in journals and publications. So Indigenous authors like myself, we're starting our own journals, our own publication kinds of venues to allow for that other voice to come through. And this is happening among other ethnic studies programs as well. So it's not only Native Studies that is doing this. But there are, in 1992, I created and helped to bring forward the story of Pueblo Indians of New Mexico. And as I mentioned, the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, nothing of that nature had ever been produced by a Native tribe, a Native people, before that time, and now there are many such stories, histories. But I have to say that it takes some doing. You have to look for it. I mean, but that material is there. That material is there. And And I guess I would just encourage people to do that, do independent research.
We've got two questions, one here, one there.
I think quite a bit about language, and when we think about indigenous people here in Maine the children were sent to Philadelphia. In New Mexico, they were sent to Santa Fe to the schools there, and they were not allowed to speak their languages. When I taught at the University of New Mexico, they now have a school for high school students to learn their languages, and the children are teaching their parents they were not allowed to speak their languages. And I am an immigrant myself from Denmark. Danish was my first language. Language is important, and I hope that we can all, if people know languages, use them. And it is so important for Native American, for indigenous people to have those opportunities to learn their languages again and use them. That's just my thought. I wondered what you thought about that.
Well, yeah, that's part of the movement, among many communities and tribes, I have to say it's not necessarily the result of, it's a partnership that happened with the university. It was not necessarily the university's idea to do that, but yeah, at least those positive things are happening. So I agree that those things are happening, and happening in many kinds of partnerships with higher education by Native communities all over the country. But again, they tend to be marginalized and to the side. They're not mainstream kinds of initiatives. Yeah. I wanted to bring your attention just quickly to this last slide because I think it kind of addresses what has been asked. This idea that so the Aztecs have a notion, as well as other tribes, of a prediction of this time, and being faced with huge challenges and having to move into a new sun, into a new time, a new epoch. And of course, the older order resists the new, as the cosmic battle, those sacred twins mentioned in the story of Quetzalcoatl, the Mesoamerican culture hero. So this idea of paradigms battling each other, at a cosmic level, was part of the themes of the stories in Central America and also in Mexico. But this is a cosmic conflict. It represents two sides of human nature played out through the cycles of time and human history. So a new sun, a new cosmology is being born. It has to be born. And how we collectively greet it is up to us. We may embrace it. We may ignore it. We may cringe in fear, but it will rise and take its rightful place in time. And we have a saying, we are all kernels in the same basket. So while we are different, unique, we're also in the same basket. We're also, in a sense, indigenous to the earth, really. And so this is now that time where we have to make these kinds of understandings manifest and begin to, in a sense, change the paradigms, towards becoming good ancestors, into our future.
Another question up here.
First, a quick response. There's a book called An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. My question is, over the many years you've been teaching, I'm wondering if you could speak in any way that occurs to you about the difference in your experience of your students 45-ish years ago versus now.
Oh yes, that's a good question. And I actually was talking to Roxanne. She came to give a talk last Wednesday. I was talking to Roxanne. She used to be my predecessor as one of the directors of Native Studies at UNM. Yeah, there's been a lot of changes. In my time, because we were raised largely in our own communities, we spoke our languages, at least in my communities, my places. So our intent was to get a Western education, get a job, and make it in the Western world. It was not so much about identity or re-identifying ourselves, because we hadn't been away from it, we hadn't lost it. So that was my own particular group's generation. So we were trying to get the American pie, trying to get that skill. Over the years, particularly my class that I'll go see on Thursday, is very different-minded. Many of my Native students are passionate about giving back to their communities. They are very cognizant of the history of Native people, because we give in-depth understanding of the histories of Native people in our courses. They have skills, they're developing skills in research, in governance, in leadership, to be able to go right into the communities and into their professions and make a difference. They want to make a difference. So there's a kind of, so there's one picture of a Native student, apathetic, doesn't know what the world, and that also was them. Once they got into a comprehensive Native studies program like ours, something clicked, something came alive, and they're coming out as these, I would be scared of them actually, if I were on the other end of their activism. Truthfully, they're that strong. And so I see that distinct change in them, and that was over a course of, so I have a great faith in a well-developed, comprehensive education program that focuses on these outcomes, what it can do, particularly for Indigenous populations. And so Indigenous people all over the world are trying to find ways to create Indigenous studies programs, and they're trying to find ways to create Indigenous education programs that disseminate that information to their communities. And so I have some hopeful, I have a hopeful future for my students and for the work that they can do in their communities. And I know they will become leaders. But that's not necessarily the case. I also run into lots of students that are apathetic, and other students that are, they have deep pain, deep wounds, in terms of the issues that are before them. Don't know quite what to do. So I have also students that come and seeking out an alternative view of the world, an alternative perspective, so that they can have some hope as well. So that's my experience, a big change, over the generations in terms of what students are striving for. They're starving for this kind of information. They're starving for this kind of perspective. They're starving for a guiding philosophy. And our institutions are not giving it to them. There are islands, of course, in every university where these kinds of things are happening, these good things are happening with students, but they're far too few. And so that's on our institutions to begin to create those kinds of spaces.
That's it. We don't have any more questions. Do you have a final word to share with us?
Well, I guess I'll end with this slide. This dawning of a new place. This is a ceremonial cave in Bandelier National Monument in just outside of Los Alamos, New Mexico, where they created the atomic bomb. It's just about 2-3 miles from there. And it represents the sun. Those things that look like bushes are actually the tops of trees. So this is a cave that's 200 feet above the ground, and the sun is just coming up, and so that definitely that site, those ruins were created to greet the sun as it's coming up. And I think a lot of what we're doing now is we're creating a place to create, to greet this new sun that's rising, you know, with all its challenges, with all its issues. Because of climate change, because of the changes that it'll bring into so many aspects of our life in the times to come, you know, we are facing a challenging sun. You know, a sun that's going to challenge us to the very core of our being, not only as individuals but also as whole societies. And I think, you know, we have to sort of pause and think about what our place is going to be in ushering in that new sun. You know, we may not stay on Earth that long, you know, to usher in more than just a few decades of that. But nonetheless, we have a responsibility to greet it and to, in a sense, prepare for it in the best way that we can. And I think that's a part of our philosophies and our prophecies. And certainly we're at that place in this time, you know, to be thinking about that, to be deeply dialoguing about that. And to think about, you know, the institutions of the future that will hopefully manifest some of these more positive changes, you know, for humankind as a whole. So I've become, you know, I started with my community, then I went on to the IAIA, which is still my community, and then went on to the University of New Mexico. And I find myself now more of a global thinker. So the idea of, you know, act locally but think globally, you know, is certainly a part of my mantra. And so that as we move forward, you know, we have to begin to think about and teach for that. So although I'm retiring, as I said, you know, I'm just moving on to a newer, broader curriculum. You know, I'm not necessarily retiring from my teaching. So again, I thank you all for your kind attention. I hope I've given you some insights, some thoughts and perspectives that you can take with you, you know, as you move forward in your own quest to be a good ancestor.